Last November, author and historian Alan Guelzo shared his thoughts on NFL players kneeling in protest during the national anthem. He made remarks during a lecture on free speech and the First Amendment that runs about an hour and 15 minutes.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to put my glasses on. I only wear them when I want to see. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Alan Guelzo. Professor Guelzo is a teacher, he's a professor, and he is one of the leading historians in a variety of disciplines: early American history, religion, and cultural history. But he is perhaps best known as one of the most prolific and important historians of the American Civil War, and, of course, Abraham Lincoln. He's received numerous prestigious awards, including the Lincoln Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Prize, and he authors regularly a number of articles that are published in leading newspapers, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and he's featured regularly on television and radio programs such as NPR's Weekend Edition. He is the Henry Luce Professor of Civil War Era at Gettysburg College, where he serves as Director of the Civil War Era Studies Program. However, he is on sabbatical from Gettysburg College this year, and he serves as the William Garwood Visiting Professor in the James Madison Program of American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. You can learn more about Alan's work either by visiting his website, alanguelzo.com, but perhaps most importantly, Alan is a regular speaker at the Union League of Philadelphia and for the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. He is also a member of the Union League of Philadelphia. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alan Guelzo.
What a pleasure it is to be introduced by Joan Carter, always the most gracious of introducers, and to be invited to speak in this series, which memorializes Jack Templeton, whom I remember as both a physician and a friend. So there is privilege on all points to be enjoyed as participating in this series. What we know today as the First Amendment to the federal Constitution originally appeared in the form of a resolution attached by the Virginia State Ratifying Convention to its approval of the new Constitution in June of 1788. That resolution declared that the free exercise of religious worship cannot be canceled, abridged, restrained, or modified by the new Congress which was being created by the Constitution, nor can any other essential rights, among which were listed the liberty of conscience and of the press. This resolution was taken up by James Madison and then rewritten and adopted by the Senate in September of 1789 and finally ratified by the states on March 1st, 1792 in this form. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Madison was confident that the freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment were the source for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression. Even so, there were frequent backslidings in American political life, starting with the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, which attempted to criminalize seditious libels uttered about President John Adams. And that was followed by mob assaults on political speakers in the streets of New York and Baltimore in 1804, in 1810, in 1811, and 1815. In 1835 alone, there were 147 political riots in the United States, leading to the deaths of 63 people. A riot, in fact, in Alton, Illinois in 1837 ended in the death of the abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, and prompted the first great political speech of the up-and-coming Illinois lawyer, Abraham Lincoln. Not until after the First World War did the U.S. Supreme Court finally and unambiguously declare the triumph of Madison's doctrine, saying in Abrams versus United States that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and not the action of a mob or the sanction of a magistrate. And yet, nearly 250 years after James Madison hailed the First Amendment as the triumph of reason and humanity, we once more find argument after argument being deployed, and especially in university environments, to overthrow that triumph and silence free speech. But this overthrow comes not in the old guise of brute tyrannical force, but in the new clothing of cultural sensitivity. And it involves an argument against free speech which arrives in two stages. That first of all, culture is distinct from the political, and therefore does not enjoy the protections of free speech, and that all political speech is really cultural, and so no speech deserves protection. Let me give you some examples. In her Constitution Day lecture at Princeton University on September 20th, Carolyn Rouse, the chair of Princeton's anthropology department, dismissed any idea of an absolute liberty for free speech. After all, Rouse argued, nowhere are people allowed to say whatever they want in any context with no social, economic, legal, or political repercussions. There are, in other words, some varieties of speech that nobody tries to invoke the First Amendment to protect. What then does Rouse believe serves to distinguish the speech that does from the speech that doesn't deserve the shield of the First Amendment? Rouse's answer is culture. Culture, she says, is what helps us determine the appropriateness of speech by balancing our rights as enshrined in the Constitution with understandings of context. And in a commonplace way, this seems to be true, since no one suggests that cultural vulgarity or profanity or simple bad manners are things that the First Amendment is designed to protect. The problem is that by culture, Rouse does not actually mean inhibitions on vulgarities or profanities or bad manners. What she calls culture is, in fact, politics. Only now, by calling it culture, she no longer considers herself guilty of suppressing speech protected by the First Amendment. A climate change skeptic, she explained, is not actually a political dissident, but an offender against a received culture, and as such has no right to make claims about climate change as if all the science discovered over the last X number of centuries were irrelevant. And not just climate change. In December 2016, Rouse organized a walkout by students on a lecture at Princeton by sociologist Charles Murray, charging in a flyer that Murray represented the normalization of racism and classism in academia. This is the same Charles Murray who was then shouted down and physically attacked on March 2nd by student activists at Middlebury College who were also offended by Murray's departures from their culture. In an even more sensational confrontation on May 23rd, campus authorities at Evergreen State College refused to protect biology professor Brett Weinstein from physical threat by angry student activists after Weinstein questioned the wisdom of a day of racial absence that excluded white students from the Evergreen State campus. In a foreshadowing of Rouse's Constitution Day rationalization, the Evergreen State activists insisted that Weinstein's questioning violated the norms of Evergreen's culture. He has incited white supremacists, and he has validated white supremacists and Nazis in our community and in the nation, complained one activist. And I don't think that should be protected by free speech. By redefining political speech as culture, the speech silencers are allowed to claim that your speech is not really political. Instead, it is offensive or threatening to my whiteness or blackness or gender or values, and is therefore outside the protections afforded to political speech. We may laugh at this as yet another example of the old shell game, in which political censorship is simply called by another name. Nevertheless, shell game or not, this is why the numbers of university students who told a Brookings Institute survey that they do not believe the First Amendment protects offensive speech now outnumber those who believe that it does by 44% to 39%. And why fully a fifth of those students believe that it is acceptable to inflict physical harm on those who are deemed to have made offensive and hurtful statements. Because it's all culture, not politics, even though it isn't. So what James Madison worked to attain in the name of reason and humanity now yields to the dictatorship of politics masquerading as culture, as though the nation and its institutions were a tribe rather than a republic, and any unapproved remark understood as a defection from an established cultural order. There may be some relief in realizing that the attacks on free speech in the name of culture have a history of their own, a history which from time to time has gained a measure of temporary credibility, only to have its underlying folly pull it back out to sea. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay were confident enough of their culture to insist that any deviation from it was simply a departure from accepted truth, and toleration of that infidelity would only sow doubt and confusion among the true believers who needed no further truth. He that is willing to tolerate any religion, wrote Nathaniel Ward in 1647, or discrepant way of religion besides his own, unless it be in matters merely indifferent, either doubts of his own or is not sincere in it. Supporters of the Alien and Sedition Acts were no less confident in the axioms of their political culture, and likewise felt no need to learn anything from what they regarded as palpable error. Truth has but one side, and listening to error and falsehood is indeed a strange way to discover truth, wrote the Pennsylvania lawyer Alexander Addison, in what might have passed for a parody of Rouse's Princeton lecture. Contempt and fear of free political speech were also the principal characteristics of American slavery's defenders, who also believed that they represented a culture of sorts, based this time on race. In 1835, Postmaster General Amos Kendall yielded to demands by slaveholders to censor abolitionist materials from the U.S. mail, and justified his decision by appealing to cultural values over political liberty. We owe an obligation to the laws, Kendall said, but a higher one to the community in which we live. And if the former be perverted so as to destroy the latter, it is patriotism to disregard them. So what we deal with today, in the confusion of politics and culture as an excuse for suppressing speech, is not new. But today's cultured despisers of free speech are not merely victims of a semantic confusion of culture and politics. And this is what leads to the second stage of this new strategy of overthrow. A second stage which says that there is nothing which is legitimately political anymore, that all political speech really is cultural, and thus can be severely regulated without any reference to the First Amendment. In fact, the First Amendment becomes a dead letter. The genealogy of this second stage is long and begins with Karl Marx, or rather with the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci believed that Marx had missed an important detail in describing how the working class should, one fine day, overthrow the capitalist ruling class. Marx described the working class as oppressed by the political and economic power of the European ruling classes. Gramsci, however, believed that matters were actually worse than that. The working class is oppressed, he said, not only by the political and economic power of the European ruling classes, but by ruling class culture, which entices and persuades the working class to adopt the cultural values and attitudes of their rulers. Political revolution, therefore, would have to be about the overthrow of that culture first. Gramsci's ideas won their biggest following among Americans of the New Left in the 1960s. Under the plea of free speech, complained Herbert Marcuse, the doyen of the New Left, tolerance is extended to policies, conditions, and modes of behavior which should not be tolerated, because the tolerance expressed in such impartiality serves to minimize or even absolve prevailing intolerance and suppression. This is practically indistinguishable from the plea of Ward and Addison and Kendall, but it reclothes that plea in the more appealing garb of the oppressed and disadvantaged. The idea that all political speech really is cultural does, however, allow us to see a bright line connecting the attacks on free speech with the craze for monument removals that began in May in New Orleans and has peaked since the Charlottesville riot in August. On one level, rage against monuments may seem like an exercise in purely cultural criticism, especially if the monuments are examples of bad taste. Think of the Rocky statue on the steps of the Museum of Art. But in the world of Marxist ideology after Gramsci, culture absorbs politics. Hence, the Confederate statues in New Orleans and Charlottesville, which have been at the eye of this storm, cannot be merely statues or merely cultural artifacts in the usual sense of the word culture. Confederate memorials on these terms were never and are never less than what one fervent history professor at the University of North Carolina described as a campaign to paint the Southern cause in the Civil War as just and slavery as a benevolent institution, and made a very pointed statement about the rule of white supremacy. No, actually, the monuments didn't do that. Actually, it was the laws of the Jim Crow era that did that. No one has yet shown that General Lee descended from his monumental horse in Charlottesville to burn crosses along the Blue Ridge at night. What is cultural only becomes literally threatening, and what is offensive only becomes literally lethal when it is translated into regulations. By the same token, however, removals of offensive speakers or offensive public art become more than merely sympathetic and pitying responses to bad taste. They are a practical and aggressive strategy under the cover of appeals to cultural offense for suppressing political disagreement. And since the goal of the dissent is the destabilization of a political order, it should come as no surprise that the cultural rage of the Confederate monument activists often shades over into furious condemnations of the entirety of American history. It is not merely Confederate generals who have become targets. Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, decided last month to remove the plaque marking the pew once occupied by George Washington because it might make some visitors feel unsafe or unwelcome. Student activists at the University of Wisconsin at Madison campaigned in 2016 to decolonize our campus around a statue of Abraham Lincoln, which was deemed belittling because Lincoln, according to one of the organizers, owned slaves and ordered the execution of native men. Nor is it likely to stop even with American history. In May, as the New Orleans Confederate statues were being brought down, even a statue of Joan of Arc was spray painted with "Tear it down." Joan of Arc? This is to cloud understanding with words. It is to perform what Michael Polanyi called a moral inversion, an intellectual juggling act, in which we invoke the language of cultural offense as a stratagem for silencing political dissent. Do not be deceived. Culture is culture, and politics is politics. And we are in deep trouble when one absorbs the other. But let us not be simplistic. Carolyn Rouse is certainly correct in one respect. Culture does influence speech. There is some speech which is rude and some which is foolish, and cultural values encourage boorish people to censor their rudeness and their foolishness. Even Oliver Wendell Holmes, the author of the Abrams decision, recognized the serious public harm that can result from someone falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. But what Rouse and the Gramscians ignore is that culture and politics really are two different quantities. Cultural inhibitions are vague and consensual and easily liable to transgression and shifting. Politics is about laws, which involves crimes and punishments, and which take time to implement and time to repeal. Again, culture becomes lethal only when power is invoked to terminate the competition for cultural expression. Rouse is also correct to say that there are different arenas of speech. In the private sphere, one person can tell another person to stop gossiping or to stop demanding that the umpire be killed without that being a trespass on the First Amendment. While in the public sphere, a different standard applies. The problem Rouse does not address is that the line separating the private sphere, where the First Amendment may not operate, and the public, where it does, is not always clear. For instance, Rouse believes that hate speech has no place in the university because it violates the culture of the university. And she also believes that the university can act to suppress such hate speech without violating the First Amendment because the university operates within the private sphere and can thus live by its own private rules. But the idea that the university is a private enclave that can establish the boundaries of the cultural and the political for itself is becoming less and less persuasive. For one thing, discouraging some forms of cultural speech in academe may actually be bad for academe as a community of inquiry even if culture is not the province of the First Amendment, and especially if the discouragement comes not as the result of debate, but before the debate is even begun. This would be to introduce into the life of the university something akin to the spirit of the Red Queen. Sentence first, verdict afterward. But Rouse is in even greater danger from the way that university life in modern America has long since left any precincts that could be called private or even communal. Once upon a time, we could speak of private and of public higher education as two entirely different worlds. And when we did, we took for granted that state-authorized and state-funded higher education would be prevented from restricting or controlling academic speech, since public higher education belonged to the public sphere, while private higher education could do as it wished, however wisely or foolishly. But the wall of separation between public and private higher education has been eroding for the last half-century. Funding from public sources now constitutes the bulk of higher education resources in the United States, private as much as public, whether in the form of government subventions for research and programs, or in the much vaster influx of government-guaranteed student loans. For all realistic purposes, the distinction between public and private higher education has ceased to exist. And with it, so has the assumption that there exists a private world of higher education which is somehow exempt from the application of the First Amendment. Ironically, if it is hatefulness and hate speech which the despisers of free speech want to target, then it is curious that some of the most vile examples of hateful speech have occurred within the very groves of presumably private colleges and universities, and from those most committed to suppressing rather than expanding free speech rights. On November 12, 2015, 150 Black Lives Matter activists invaded the Baker Berry Library at Dartmouth, assaulting one female student and shouting to others in the library, and I will pause here to say that as a respecter of the culture of the Union League of Philadelphia, I will not entirely repeat the words that were used. Suffice it to say that the activists shouted, "Bleep you, you filthy white bleeps. Bleep you and your comfort, and bleep you, you racist blips." This was a way of expressing solidarity with our brothers and sisters across the country who are staring terrorism and assault directly in the face. Dartmouth College's Office of Communications subsequently released a statement affirming Dartmouth's loyalty to the principles of free speech, public protest, and inclusivity. However, the college also declined to take any action against the library invasion because there were no specific violations of the standards of conduct. Some standards. Some conduct. The Dartmouth affair was swiftly followed by the Demands of Black Voices incident at another presumably private university, Duke, where the target shifted from intimidating students to intimidating faculty. Among the demands was the requirement that professors will be in danger of losing their jobs and non-tenure track faculty will lose tenure status if they perpetuate hate speech that threatens the safety of students of color. They will also be liable if the discriminatory attitudes behind the speech could potentially harm the academic achievements of students of color. This fall, Reed College's Humanities 110 course began with student demonstrations in the classroom which attacked Assistant Professor Lucia Martinez Valdivia as a race traitor, anti-black, and ableist, driving Valdivia to admit that I am scared to teach courses on race, gender, or sexuality, or even texts that bring these issues up in any way. I'm at a loss as to how to begin to address it, especially since many of these students don't believe in historicity or objective facts. The atmosphere was even more intimidating at Reed when a guest speaker was shouted down with, "Bleep this cis white bitch." Cis being shorthand for cisgendered, or people who identify with their birth sex. And bleep your transphobia. I would like to be able to say that college students will sometimes simply be college students and walk away. But I have some difficulty understanding these examples of speech silencing as anything but hateful, and even more difficulty understanding why they are tolerated within institutions where the boundaries between public and private have long since zigzagged away into the distance. When the habit of moral inversion becomes this commonplace in institutions which, like it or not, have become the narrow straits through which young adults must pass in order to gain admission to economic opportunity, we may depend upon seeing this habit replicated in the larger society. The only consolation to be drawn, and it is not one to rejoice in, is that the activists who are today the most relentless in their demands will be the first ones sent to the wall by the next wave of activists they will have spawned. Last month, the University of California at Berkeley, the home of the 1960s free speech movement, was slated to host a Free Speech Week, featuring the sensationalistic alt-right provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, an event which then had to be canceled by its sponsors, citing extraordinary pressure and resistance, if not outright hostility, from the university's administration. There is no question in my mind that Yiannopoulos represents one of the poorest imaginable occasions for free speech, but the real issue was stated with admirable clarity by a Berkeley sidewalk chalk artist who wrote simply, "Free speech kills." I am moved to say, from a very different angle, that indeed free speech does kill, which is why James Madison was so determined to protect it. It kills stupidity, sloth, corruption, small-mindedness, pride, overconfidence, and self-righteousness. Free speech embarrasses, disrupts, and exposes, and therein lies its real offense. Moreover, the genuinely oppressed, as opposed to the hustlers of faux outrage, have always known freedom of speech to be their best friend. Witness Frederick Douglass. "Liberty is meaningless," Douglass said in 1860, "where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That, of all rights, is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. Thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers founded in injustice and wrong are sure to tremble if men are allowed to reason of righteousness, of temperance, and of a judgment to come in their presence. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South." Or witness George Orwell. "If liberty means anything at all," Orwell said, "it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." Witness Benjamin Franklin. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. Witness John Milton. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. Witness even the pre-Gramscian Marxist Rosa Luxemburg. Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for one who thinks differently, because all that is instructive, wholesome, and purifying in political freedom depends on this essential characteristic. Argue with them if you like, but do not expect me to believe that freedom of speech is some disguised puppetry of the powerful. It is, to the contrary, an indispensable ingredient in the recipe for preventing tyrannies. Tyrannies, be they of the left or of the right, be they in the name of the fatherland, the Volk, or the workers. There are always two great questions to be asked at such moments of crisis. Who is to blame, and what is to be done? We have now seen just how many hands are soiled with blame for the present crisis of the First Amendment. But what is to be done? The great instinct of humanity, even when facing catastrophe, is to do nothing rather than something. But we will not make ourselves safe by doing nothing, or by doing as the greengrocer described by Václav Havel in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless. A greengrocer who every morning during Soviet rule in Eastern Europe hung out a sign, "Workers of the world unite." It was a slogan which the greengrocer knew was untrue, Havel wrote, but which he hung out anyway, because these things must be done in order to get along in life and to guarantee him a relatively tranquil life in harmony with society. But this, Havel warned, only allowed the regulators to conceal from the greengrocer, and the greengrocer to conceal from himself, the low foundations of his obedience. The ultimate tragedy of the greengrocer, though, is that he does not need to lie like this to himself. He can choose to live in truth, and truth, said Havel, is a bacteriological weapon, so to speak, utilized when conditions are ripe by a single civilian to disarm an entire division. So we return to the question, what is to be done? Three things, at least, force themselves on us. First, make common cause. In his new book, The Once and Future Liberal, the reflective Mark Lilla warns people of his own left persuasion not to be seduced by the air horns and pepper spray of the silencers. We are all voices in a democratic chorus of citizens, pleads Lilla. People on the left must stop thinking of themselves as the vanguard of a movement whose goal is to replace argument with taboo and run conservative political speakers off campus in a purging ritual. I entertain a galaxy of disagreements with Mark Lilla on specific policies and politics and points, but on the common ground of citizen, he and I are flesh of the same flesh and bone of the same bone, and we must seek each other out. Here is another example of common cause. This fall, 15 distinguished academics from Yale, Princeton, and Harvard, including Princeton's Robert George and John Londrigan, Harvard's Adrian Vermeule, Yale's David Galertner, published together a letter of advice for the class of 2021, urging newly arrived students to remember that the central point of a college education is to seek truth and to learn the skills and acquire the virtues necessary to be a lifelong truth seeker. And Princeton President Christopher Eisgruber, in his remarks at the university's opening exercises on September 10th, insisted that independent thinking is at the heart of the liberal arts education and rests on a careful and respectful engagement with views very different from your own. The layers of reverence for free expression which underlie the First Amendment are deep in American life. But that depth cannot be felt unless, on all hands, Americans of democratic will set aside their partisanships for a moment and trust each other enough as citizens to say that the outrages against free speech must end. Second, among the things that must be done, defund. The anti-free speech activists are not great in numbers, but they possess deep wells of financial support, much of it through foundations and charities to which you and your firms are often asked innocently to contribute. To the extent that these organizations are private entities, they have exactly the freedom for which I plead, to state their minds. But the institutions of higher education, where the most visible suppressions of free speech have taken place, are not, at least in any meaningful sense of the term. And in today's financial environment, they are acutely responsive to the slightest puff of philanthropic or legislative disapproval. Of the 40 biggest university endowments, 35 experienced declines in 2016, even at a time when the overall market rose by 13%. As a whole, university and college endowments shrank across the boards by 2%. Middlebury College suffered a 9.1% loss in its endowment value. Dartmouth lost 4.1%, while Reed College's modest endowment lost 5.4%. By the end of 2017, Moody's Investment Services predicted that the closure rate of small colleges could easily triple over that of the last decade. These are not, in other words, institutions which can afford to ignore inquiry into their patterns of speech suppression. It is time to press on that weakness. This is not a pleasant recommendation for those for whom Auld Lang Syne and appeals to the alma mater are the principal motive for writing annual contributions. I ask only whether Auld Lang Syne and alma mater must weigh more heavily in your minds than the First Amendment. We are not talking here about mere embarrassing bad frat boy behavior on campuses or professorial eccentricity. We are talking about orchestrated campaigns to assault the fundamental liberties of the American Republic, tolerated by campus administrators who in equal measure fear confrontations with student activists as a threat to their career advancement, and who hope that no news of their cravenness leaks out to the press and to the alumni. Target your giving as intelligently and purposefully as you target your personal investing. Stand with those who stand for free speech. Defund those who will not. And do not pass by on the other side. Finally, act. The stakes here are not minor ones. On October 4th, Black Lives Matter activists stormed a stage at William and Mary, a public Virginia institution where the American Civil Liberties Union's Claire Guthrie Gastinega was about to speak on students and the First Amendment. They drowned out Castañeda with cries of ACLU, you protect Hitler too. And the revolution will not uphold the Constitution. Well, it surely will not. But you must. I have no regard for either the fanatics of the neo-Nazi right or the new Red Guards of the Antifa left. What I do know is that both rejoice in the death of free speech, and so both have raised their hand against the laws that have guaranteed us the exercise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When you see and hear such attacks on free speech, speak, write, stand, rebuke, testify. It is too important for you, like Havel's greengrocer, to make meaningless noises in the hope of being spared yourself. And by the same token, when you see foolish people parading foolish ideas about race or gender or equality, ideas which reason and truth cry out against, show again by how you respond that even under the greatest of provocations, no one is authorized in the great forum of the Republic's life to silence another. The strongest retort to an offensive speaker is an empty room. The strongest retaliation to a neo-Nazi parade is a curb full of people turning their backs. Is this merely a foolish sentimentality on my part? I do not think so. And I do not speak now as a white man seeking to excuse the stupidities of other white men, or as an academic eager, as we in the professoriate so often are, to foul his own professional nest by telling stories of academic folly out of school. I do not even now speak as an American, but as a friend to all disfranchised humanity in the everlasting war between commoners and kings. Which is why I say, when the black maskers finally feel emboldened enough to come with nooses and baseball bats, whether for Charles Murray or Brett Weinstein or Carolyn Rouse, I say, take me first. When they come for the Pentecostal bakers, for the Mormons, for the Jews, for the Catholics, for the atheists, I say, take me first. When they come for you, my friends, if I am still here to say it, I will say, take me first. That is the answer of James Madison, of the First Amendment, and the only worthwhile answer of the free spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now have questions and answers. Questions? Emily has.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'd like to know your take on the kneeling during the national anthem.
I remember a rusher, not on a sports team, a rusher who carried an American flag, the regimental flag of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, in its attack on the Confederate fort known as Battery Wagner outside Charleston, South Carolina, in July of 1863. The 54th Massachusetts was an all-black regiment, one of the first to be recruited after the Emancipation Proclamation. The attack was almost a suicide mission. The regiment swept up to the walls of the fort, penetrated briefly, only to be driven out with heavy losses. The rusher I am thinking of was the color sergeant of the regiment. His name was William H. Carney. He had been born a slave. He was now a free man and a soldier. He brought the Stars and Stripes off the ramparts of Fort Wagner, despite being wounded in the chest and the leg, staggered back under fire to a field hospital. And there, just before he collapsed, he surrendered the flag into the hands of several others there, saying, "The old flag never touched the ground, boys." Before the 1st of January, 1863, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law, that man didn't have a flag. He didn't have a country. He had been a slave. He was an unperson. But in July of 1863, he was a free man. And as a free man, there was no symbol to him of greater value than that flag. So you understand that it is difficult for me to understand why people would insult it by taking a knee, whatever that means. I would not do that myself, nor can I encourage anyone to do likewise, no matter how much they disagree with policies or politicians. And yet, for their right to do it, I will be the first to defend them. For I know of no federal statute which forbids what was done, or of anything in the Constitution. And I am no more eager to suppress someone's dissent, expressed even in that symbolic fashion. I'm no more eager to suppress that dissent than I am to have them suppress mine on other issues. It is the genius of a democracy that the laws we pass for others also rule us. If I want freedom of speech in the public sphere, then I must respect it in others, no matter how much I reprobate it, disagree with it, and wish it had not happened. But I come back to the Abrams decision. The best response to speech that you disagree with is speech of your own that competes in the marketplace of ideas. I do not know of any other way that a free and open society can conduct itself. Does that mean we take risks? Does that mean we incur embarrassments? Yes. But in the long view, the embarrassments and the risks fade. And I think I will take the chance of them. That's a long answer, but...
I wonder what you think about the fact that a private Quaker school refused to have a Muslim person who was a faculty at Swarthmore, after being scheduled, told he couldn't speak there.
I know a doctor who told me on one occasion when I was telling her about attending a holiday concert where I heard a wonderful arrangement of O Holy Night. She said, "You know, when I was in high school, I tried out for singing the solo for O Holy Night, and I was going to get it too, except they, at the last minute, decided that it was not a good idea for the soloist in O Holy Night to be Jewish." And I have to say that I think the same thing in this case as well. And again, I am willing to take those risks. Now, a great deal does depend. You speak of a Quaker school. I don't know all the details of this. If this is indeed a private institution, funded privately through the donations and the tuition of those who are willingly part of that community, then inhabiting the private sphere, they have the right to set those rules. Just as in my household, I have a right to say to my 3 children, eat your vegetables. Actually, I don't say that to them anymore. They say it to me. No, they're much too big for me to say that. But there was a time when I did. I can do that within my own domicile without violating the First Amendment. And if that school genuinely is a domicile, if it is a private organization, then yes, they have a right to determine who will speak and who will not, just as any church or any synagogue has a right to determine who will speak or who will preside. It is when we cross the boundary from the private to the public that becomes less and less convincing. And the arguments for exclusion become more and more onerous and more ominous at the same time. And in institution after institution that I am acquainted with, even when there are arguments that are put forward in the name of being a private organization, I know full well that in fact the life's blood of the aforementioned institution is really coming from public funds. And I think that creates a serious contradiction when we begin talking about exclusion and about discrimination. Perhaps there is a fundamental problem in our society today that we have become such a complex and interdependent society that it is hard to disentangle the public and the private. That the public has become so pervasive an influence in what previously were private spheres that increasingly we lose any sense of that distinction. That is a problem, but it is a separate problem from the problem that is posed by people who will take public money extracted unwillingly from others, and then turn and violate the fundamental canons of the Constitution. That, I find, at best, deeply, deeply questionable and worthy of a lot of scrutiny, and at worst, I find it ominous for the future. That is not a society that I think lives up to the ideals of the American experiment, or a society that we should have much enthusiasm for inhabiting. I know that sounds grim, and yet I have seen so many occasions in the past year of behavior that makes me think in grim terms and requires grim responses. Again, a long answer.
Doctor, I take issue with your comments on cultural and political. I think more emphasis should have been put on the path of the culture to overwhelm the political. And I think what's happened on the left is that they've assumed they're smarter than the right. And I think that's amplified in the current narrative, and that they're on the right side of history. I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, I have known some very intelligent people on the right who behave badly. That grieves me. I've also known some people on the left who have intelligent things to say that I don't like to hear, but which is probably a good thing for me to hear. I would prefer to hear all of those voices because I know that I don't know everything. Now, there are some people who believe that they do. We all know who they are. And of course, they're not us. But arrogance and stupidity are not the province of any one particular political system. You can find them just about everywhere you can find human nature. I prefer to look at the question you've raised, and it is a good one, I'd prefer to look at that question from the other end of the telescope and ask myself what it is I can learn, or if I conclude that this is not something that should be learned, how can I say it in such a way that convinces the person I think is wrong? That requires patience. It requires humility. I will not profess to be either patient or humble. But I do say this to my students, and I've said it to them over and over again. There is nobody that you cannot learn something from. I say that in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's social, sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's professional. I have very good students at Gettysburg College. They're creme de la creme. But sometimes I worry that because they are creme de la creme, they think that that makes them better than the bricklayer or the paper hanger. No, it doesn't. It just makes you different in the work that you do. There is nobody, paper hanger, gardener, nobody that you cannot learn something from. And the moment that you believe that you have moved beyond the need for learning from others, then I'm reminded of some advice Martin Luther once gave to young theology students. He said, at that moment when you believe you know everything, reach back and feel your ears, and there you will find a large, long, silky pair of donkey ears growing. And I say that first about myself. I have been many years in higher education, and I will be the first to tell you, brothers and sisters, I've got a lot to learn, and I'm going to keep on doing it right until the very last breath I draw. I think if we keep that in view, if we keep that sense of knowing that we don't know everything, that may be one of the best guarantees of a future in which we do not have to feel grim about each other. I think humility becomes a democracy. Humility does not become aristocracies, because in aristocracies are built on honor. They're built on boasting. They're built on braggadocio and manipulation. Democracies are not. Democracies say something very interesting. They say, as our Declaration of Independence says, that every person comes into this world from the hand of their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You come, so to speak, hardwired with certain natural rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And everybody has them in the same quantity. That's what makes us equal. We possess the same quotients of those natural rights. That means that everybody sitting in this room, everybody in the city of Philadelphia, everybody in the United States of America, every citizen is capable of governing themselves. In the ears of monarchs and kings and princes and dukes and tin pot dictators, that produces guffaws of laughter. The idea that ordinary people can govern themselves without being ridden like horses by those who wear boots and spurs given to them by life. No, the idea of democracy actually flies right in the face of that laughter. And it says, no, the ordinary citizen is, in fact, capable of governing themselves. And ordinary citizens taken as a group are capable of governing themselves. And the first 100 names in the Philadelphia telephone book would govern a city better than aristocrats and monarchs and kings and dukes. And I think that's true. But because it's true, I look at each and everyone here and all other fellow citizens with me, and I see in them citizens. There is something sacred about that word. Abraham Lincoln had a black valet who worked for him, a free man who accompanied the Lincolns from Springfield, Illinois, when Lincoln was elected president of Washington, D.C. His name was William Johnson. In January of 1863, I'm sorry, 64. I have to get my footnotes right. In January of 1864, Johnson developed smallpox. Died of it. He didn't have much in the way of money. Lincoln paid for the funeral and the burial, and for the grave marker. It had the name William Johnson, and underneath one word: citizen. I know of no title of nobility higher on this planet than that of citizen of the American Republic. And as we are all citizens, let us learn from each other, let us work with each other, and let us speak frankly, firmly, and wisely to each other. That, I think, is the model that the founders wanted to hand down to us.
Hi, my name is Ryan Callahan. I'm a senior at Holy Ghost Prep in Bucks County. And I was wondering, as we've seen recently, many of those who are trying to crush free speech, like the students at UC Berkeley and Dartmouth, they're mainly millennials and members of Generation Z and the young citizens of America who will be the future of America not too long from now. I was wondering if you see these unrowdy college students pressuring for a change of the First Amendment when they become the leaders, or creating this culture of fear in which people are too fearful to speak freely for fear of being attacked.
Am I afraid of that? Yes. Yes, I am. But that is why I'm speaking tonight. That is why I'm speaking whenever I have the opportunity. This is why I speak in faculty meeting. It is why I speak in department chairs meeting. It's why I speak on campuses. It's why I speak to individuals. Some people probably think I speak too much on the subject. Maybe I do. But I know that I have to say it. And you have to say it as well. And if what we are concerned with is a rising generation which seems to have no interest or respect for the First Amendment, for the Constitution, for the principles of the Republic, then fine. What is our task? Is it to sit and moan, to regret it, to wish that it was somehow different? No. Our task is to speak ourselves. And where the air horns and the pepper spray attempt to silence us, to bear that burden and to speak anyway, to speak at all times and in all places, because that is what free people do. So I say to you as a young person, from one who is not young in years, but I would like to think still retains some streaks of youth within, let us both join together and speak and repeat over and over and over again those words for which we have filled national cemeteries, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if that means that you and I, one terrible day, stand on a dusty hilltop, back to back, down to our last cartridge, then, friend, let's go down gloriously, because that's a principle worth going down for.
I think we have time for one more question.
Good evening. My name is Michael Denofa. I'm also a student at Holy Ghost Prep. Thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask you again about the national anthem protests in the NFL. There are those who say that the players have a constitutional right to kneel and that the NFL cannot take that right away from them. And there are also those who say that as a private organization, in order to protect their profits, the NFL can reprimand them or suspend them or fire them. Which right do you believe is more important, the players or the owners?
The NFL is not a private organization. I mean, it has some trappings of it. But who pays for the stadiums that they play in? Who provides the subventions? Look at federal budgets and find out how much public money goes in those directions. much more than you might think. In that environment, I would rather take my chances on those who kneel, because I can persuade them. And if I cannot persuade them, then perhaps someone else wiser than myself can. And even if at the end of the day I cannot persuade them, then I will still live as a citizen beside them, hoping that by my example, if not by my words, I may work some change in their thinking. But at the end of the day, I cannot force another free spirit into conformity when what they operate within is a sphere where the boundary between public and private has become porous and effaced. There I must hesitate. Yes, in a strictly private environment, and there are still some, in a strictly private environment, a rule can be made, a firing can take place. I have, however, seen much more in the way of firings of people who dissented in the other direction. I think of Brendan Eich. I think of James Damore of Google. I think of the software engineer who wrote about the difficulties posed by his job, in which his friends of, shall we say, a left persuasion felt perfectly free to make whatever comments and impose whatever humiliations they liked in the workplace, while he had no such liberty, but had instead to hide his opinions. I see a great deal more of that. And I think that that poisons the life of the Republic. Rather than see that, I will take the chance. I will take the risk of those who kneel, who take the knee. In my heart, I reprobated as strenuously as I could anything. But the freedom to make that decision to me is even more precious.
Thank you. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. And before you go, we have a small gift for you, which John promised me is right here. Okay. This is a docent's guide to the Union League. I'm sure that most of you who are in this room are aware that the League is filled with a number of unbelievably important artifacts, particularly Civil War things.
Particularly.
So this was funded by Pina Templeton and the Templeton Foundation, and I know you are aware of them. And Pina has also funded the Templeton Liberty Series, and we thank you so much for being part of that tonight.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And it is a wonderful book, and it will be on sale next week for all of our Union League members just in time for Christmas. You can check the concierge desk and anywhere else we sell our wonderful Union League stuff. So thank you very much. We'll see you on January 10th for our next Liberty Series program. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Tonight